My hands still tremble when I think about that night, the night I realized everything I'd built wasn't enough for the people I loved. I had spent decades sacrificing, only to be shattered in a moment of silence, overhearing my own daughter talking about me with strangers I didn't understand, strangers she called illegals. The word cut through me like glass, but not because of what it meant, because of how she said it, with such cold calculation, as if my life's work was nothing more than a transaction. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I am Eleanor Margaret Murphy, 72 years old, and I live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on Northern Boulevard in Queens. The wallpaper is faded yellow, peeling at the corners where the humidity seeps through. My hands are spotted with age, my wedding ring loose on my finger since I lost weight from all the worry. Every morning, I wake to the same symphony of urban chaos, garbage trucks grinding their gears at 5 in the morning, sirens wailing like wounded animals, the distant rumble of the subway that never stops, never rests, just like the ache in my chest. My daily routine had become a ritual of quiet desperation. I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my worn terry cloth slippers, the ones Sarah gave me 3 Christmases ago before everything changed. The coffee maker would gurgle to life while I stared out at my tiny balcony garden. 6 small pots of geraniums, their red blooms defiant against the gray concrete landscape of Queens. The scent of those flowers was my only comfort some days, the only thing that smelled like home in a world that had grown foreign around me. That particular evening in March, the air was thick with the promise of spring but still cold enough to make my arthritic joints ache. I had spent the day at Mount Sinai Hospital, my 3rd visit that month for my blood pressure medication. The doctors barely looked at me, their young faces buried in clipboards, treating me like another number in their endless queue of forgotten elderly patients. When I got home, exhausted and feeling invisible, I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, eaten alone at my small formica table while the news droned on about things I couldn't control. The apartment walls in my building are paper thin, a cruel joke played by landlords who stuff as many units as possible into spaces meant for half the number. I've learned to live with my neighbors' arguments, their crying babies, their late-night television shows. But that night, as I walked to the kitchen for a glass of water before bed, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Sarah's voice. My daughter's voice, coming from the apartment next door where she was visiting her friend Jennifer. At first, I thought nothing of it. Sarah often dropped by Jennifer's place after work. They'd known each other since college, back when my daughter still called me every Sunday and asked about my health with genuine concern. But as I stood there, my bare feet cold against the linoleum floor, the words I heard made my world crumble. "The old lady doesn't suspect anything," Sarah was saying, her voice carrying that familiar tone of irritation she used when talking about inconveniences. "She just keeps sending the money, no questions asked. It's perfect." A man's voice responded, heavily accented, speaking in broken English. "And she won't find out about the transfers? The ones to Miguel and Carlos?" My heart stopped. Miguel and Carlos. Names I'd never heard my daughter mention, names that didn't belong in any story she'd ever told me about her life. I pressed my ear closer to the thin wall, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. "Look," Sarah continued, and I could hear her moving around, probably pacing the way she did when she was nervous. "My mother set up this trust fund years ago. She thinks it's all going to my kids' education, but I've been redirecting portions of it for months. She never checks the statements. These guys need the money to get their families here safely, and honestly, she'll never miss it. She has more than enough saved up." "But what if she finds out?" another voice asked, female this time, probably Jennifer. Sarah laughed, a sound that once brought me joy but now felt like nails on a chalkboard. "She won't. And if she does, what's she going to do? Cut me off? She's too afraid of losing me. She'd rather be broke than be alone." The word illegals came next, spoken so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if these were just obstacles to be managed rather than human beings seeking help. But worse than the word itself was the realization that my daughter saw me not as a person worthy of truth and respect, but as a resource to be managed and manipulated. I staggered backward, my hand clutching the wall for support. The room spun around me as the full weight of what I'd heard settled in my chest like a stone. For decades, I had believed I was building something meaningful with my sacrifices. Every dollar I'd scraped together, every comfort I'd denied myself, every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about my family's future, it was all being stolen from me, and worse, I was being mocked for my generosity. The photos of Sarah's childhood stared at me from the refrigerator door. Her gap-toothed smile at age 7, arms wrapped around a stuffed elephant I'd worked overtime to buy her. Her high school graduation, where I sat in the front row, tears streaming down my face with pride. Her wedding day, where I'd walked her down the aisle because her father had died 2 years earlier from a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. I thought about that trust fund, established with my husband's life insurance money after his funeral. $40,000 that was supposed to secure my grandchildren's futures, money that represented every sacrifice Robert and I had made during 35 years of marriage. Money that was apparently funding something my daughter was too ashamed to discuss with me directly, involving people she referred to with such casual cruelty. The contrast between my expectations and reality felt like a physical blow. I had expected that my years of sacrifice had created a bond of mutual respect and love with my daughter. Instead, I was living in a delusion, believing I was cherished while actually being exploited. The scent of those geraniums on my balcony suddenly felt like a mockery, beautiful things trying to grow in an ugly, unforgiving environment. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the endless hum of the city that never sleeps. Sirens wailed in the distance, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my loneliness. I thought about all the times Sarah had asked for money over the years, always with a crisis, always with a deadline, always with just enough emotional manipulation to make me feel guilty for even hesitating. 3 months ago, when her car needed repairs, "Mom, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency. The kids need me to be able to drive them to school." $2,000 from my savings account. 6 months before that, when her husband lost his job, "We might lose the house, Mom. I know you've worked so hard to save, but we're desperate." $5,000, withdrawn from my retirement fund. A year ago, when my grandson needed dental work, "Insurance won't cover it, Mom. You know how important his health is to me." $3,000, money I'd been saving for my own dental problems that I kept postponing. Each time, I had convinced myself I was being a good mother, a devoted grandmother. Each time, Sarah had hugged me and called me generous, promising to pay me back when things got better. Each time, I had gone home to my small apartment, eating smaller meals and skipping medications to stretch my budget, telling myself that family was worth any sacrifice. Now I understood. I wasn't family to Sarah, I was a bank. A bank with no real oversight, no accountability, and no respect. The word illegals kept echoing in my mind, not because I had any problem with people seeking help, but because it revealed how comfortable my daughter was with deception. If she could lie about something this significant, what else had she hidden from me? The history of my sacrifices stretched back decades, each memory now tainted by this new understanding. After Robert died suddenly at 68, clutching his chest in our small queen's kitchen while making his morning coffee, I had thrown myself into supporting our children. Sarah was only 25 then, struggling to establish her marketing career while caring for her first baby. Our son Michael lived in California, too busy with his own family to offer much help with the daily challenges of single motherhood. I took on a second job, working mornings at Goldstein's Bakery in Flushing, where I decorated cakes and served customers who barely acknowledged my existence. The work was exhausting for someone in her 60s, standing on swollen feet for hours, breathing in flour dust that made me cough, smiling at customers who treated me like part of the furniture. But every dollar I earned went towards Sarah's expenses: daycare for little Emma, her car payments, health insurance premiums when her job didn't provide adequate coverage. In the afternoons, I worked as a caregiver for Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old woman with dementia who lived in a fifth-floor walk-up in Chinatown. The stairs nearly killed me every day, but the work paid cash and helped me avoid taxes on money I desperately needed. Mrs. Chen barely remembered my name, but she was kinder to me than my own daughter had become. She would hold my hand and tell me stories about her childhood in Taiwan, treating me like a friend rather than hired help. For years, I juggled these jobs while maintaining my own small apartment, cooking meals for Sarah's family twice a week, babysitting my grandchildren whenever needed, and providing emotional support for my daughter's marriage problems, career stress, and daily complaints about everything from her neighbors to her mother-in-law. I listened for hours to Sarah's problems, offering advice she rarely took and comfort she rarely acknowledged. When Emma turned 16 and needed a car, I withdrew $8,000 from my retirement account. When my younger grandson David wanted to play hockey, I covered the equipment and registration fees because Sarah claimed they couldn't afford it. When Sarah's washing machine broke, when they needed a down payment for a better apartment, when they wanted to take a family vacation to Disney World, every time, I found a way to help, even when it meant I couldn't afford to fix my own broken heater last winter. The emotional manipulation was so subtle I hadn't recognized it for what it was. Sarah never demanded money directly. Instead, she would call me crying about their financial pressures, mentioning how worried she was about the children's futures, how guilty she felt for bothering me with their problems. She would say things like, "I wish we could give the kids the childhood you gave me, Mom, but everything is so expensive now." Or, "I know you understand what it's like to sacrifice for family, you and Dad taught me that." These conversations always ended with me offering to help before Sarah could ask directly. She would protest weakly, saying she couldn't possibly take my money, that I needed to save for my own future. But when I insisted, her relief was so obvious, her gratitude so overwhelming, that I felt like a hero rather than a victim. She would hug me tightly and whisper, "I don't know what we'd do without you, Mom. You're the best grandmother those kids could ask for." But the gratitude never lasted long. Within weeks of each financial contribution, Sarah's calls would become less frequent. She would sound distracted when I tried to share my own concerns about my health, my loneliness, my struggles with the city bureaucracy that seemed designed to exhaust elderly people into submission. When I called her, she was always busy, always rushing off to somewhere more important. When I suggested family dinners, she was always too tired, too stressed, too overwhelmed with her own life to make time for mine. The birthday cards stopped coming 3 years ago. Last year, my 71st birthday passed without a single call from my daughter. When I mentioned it the following week, Sarah looked genuinely confused, then instantly defensive. "Mom, you know how crazy things have been with David's school situation and Emma starting college. I thought about you all day, I just got so busy I forgot to call. You know I love you." But I didn't know that anymore. Love had always meant action in my family. Robert showed his love by working 60-hour weeks to provide for us. I showed my love by sacrificing my comfort, my social life, my own dreams to ensure my children had every opportunity. Sarah showed her. What? What did Sarah actually do that demonstrated love rather than need? I began to notice the pattern more clearly after that missed birthday. Sarah called when she needed something, money, babysitting, emotional support during her various crises. She didn't call to check on my health, to share good news about her life, or simply to hear my voice because she missed me. Our relationship had become entirely transactional, with me always on the paying end and her always on the receiving end. When my arthritis flared up so badly I could barely open jars, I called Sarah hoping she might offer to take me grocery shopping or help with some of the heavier household tasks. She listened to my description of the pain with polite concern, then quickly shifted the conversation to her own stress about Emma's college applications. When I mentioned that I was having trouble sleeping because of the pain, she suggested I talk to my doctor, as if I hadn't already thought of that obvious solution. "I wish I could help more, Mom," she said in that practiced tone of false regret, "but with everything going on here, I'm barely keeping my head above water." Yet somehow, she had time for elaborate social media posts about her family's weekly adventures. Photos of expensive dinners, weekend trips to Long Island, shopping expeditions with Emma. Photos of a life that looked nothing like the financial desperation she described when asking for my help. I started paying closer attention to the inconsistencies. Sarah claimed they couldn't afford David's school supplies, yet her Facebook photos showed a kitchen renovation with granite countertops. She said they needed help with Emma's college expenses, yet Emma was wearing designer clothes in every photo and carrying a purse that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When I gently mentioned these observations, Sarah's response was swift and cutting. "Mom, just because we post some nice pictures doesn't mean we're living beyond our means. We save up for special occasions, and sometimes we treat ourselves because we work hard. I'm sorry if that bothers you, but I thought you'd be happy to see your grandchildren enjoying life." The words were designed to make me feel guilty for questioning her, and they worked. I apologized for being suspicious, promised I was only concerned about her well-being, and ended up sending another $1,000 to help with what she claimed was an emergency medical bill for their dog. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I began checking my bank statements more carefully, something I'd avoided doing because numbers had always overwhelmed me. What I found made my stomach turn. Over the past 3 years, I had given Sarah's family nearly $60,000. $60,000 that represented my entire safety net, my buffer against emergencies, my hope for maintaining independence as I aged. The trust fund Robert and I had established was being systematically drained, with transfers I didn't remember authorizing, for purposes that were never clearly explained. When I called the bank to ask about these transactions, the young man who answered spoke to me like I was senile. "Ma'am, these are all legitimate transfers to accounts you've authorized. Your daughter is listed as a beneficiary with withdrawal privileges. If you want to change that, you'll need to come in and fill out new paperwork." Authorizing Sarah as a beneficiary had seemed like a sensible precaution when she first suggested it 5 years ago. "Mom, God forbid something happens to you, but I should be able to access your accounts to pay your bills and take care of things." It had made perfect sense then. Now it felt like I'd handed a thief the keys to my house. That's when the real microaggressions became impossible to ignore. They had always been there, I realized, but I had been too desperate for connection to see them clearly. The way Sarah answered her phone when I called, always with a slight sigh of annoyance. The way she would glance at her watch during our conversations, making it clear my time had limits even when hers apparently didn't. The way she spoke about me to others, never openly critical, but always with subtle implications that I was becoming burdensome, needy, difficult. I started paying attention to what she said about other elderly people in our neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived alone and sometimes asked neighbors for small favors, was described by Sarah as getting clingy in her old age. Mr. Patterson, who had trouble with technology and sometimes asked for help with his smartphone, was one of those old people who won't learn anything new. The elderly woman who worked at the local grocery store and always tried to chat with customers was probably lonely, but she shouldn't bother people who are just trying to shop. The message was clear: aging meant becoming a burden, and burdens were to be tolerated rather than cherished. I was being trained to accept less and less consideration, to be grateful for crumbs of attention, to apologize for existing. The forgotten birthdays were just the beginning. When I developed a persistent cough that lasted for weeks, Sarah's response was to suggest I stop calling her so often because talking made the cough worse. When I mentioned feeling dizzy and worried about falling, she recommended I hire a cleaning service instead of asking for help with housework I could no longer safely do. Mom, you need to start thinking about what kind of help you actually need instead of expecting family to drop everything every time you have a problem. The words stung because they reframed my requests for connection as demands for service. Asking my daughter to visit wasn't about loneliness anymore, it was about my inability to cope independently. Calling her when I felt scared or confused wasn't about needing emotional support, it was about my failure to solve my own problems. But the cruelest revelation was yet to come. That night in March, as I stood in my dark kitchen listening to my daughter's voice through the thin wall, I realized that even my exploitation had been turned into a source of shame. Sarah wasn't just stealing from me, she was teaching others to see me as someone whose money was easy to take, whose trust was foolish, whose love was something to be managed rather than reciprocated. She never checks the statements. The words echoed in my mind, each repetition like a knife twist. My lack of financial sophistication, my tendency to trust people I loved, my reluctance to question my daughter's explanations, all of these had been turned into character flaws that justified taking advantage of me. I thought about all the times Sarah had praised other elderly people for being self-sufficient and not wanting to be a burden on their families. I had always felt proud when she said I was more independent than most women my age. Now I understood that my independence wasn't being celebrated, it was being maintained for her convenience. An independent mother was one who didn't ask for emotional support, didn't expect regular contact, didn't question financial irregularities, and most importantly, didn't interfere with her daughter's real life. The conversation I overheard that night contained another layer of betrayal. Sarah wasn't just stealing my money, she was using it to help people she wouldn't even acknowledge as human beings worthy of respect. The casual use of illegals revealed a coldness that frightened me more than the theft itself. If my daughter could speak so dismissively about vulnerable people seeking help, what did that say about how she saw me, another vulnerable person dependent on her supposed care? But perhaps the cruelest aspect was the way she spoke about my fears. She'd rather be broke than be alone. Sarah understood exactly what terrified me most, the prospect of dying alone, forgotten, with no one to remember that I had ever mattered to anyone. And she was using that fear against me, confident that I would tolerate any amount of disrespect, any level of exploitation, rather than risk losing the only family relationships I had left. As I stood there in my small, cold kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of a city that never noticed me, I felt something inside me break. Not shatter dramatically, but crack quietly, the way ice breaks when it's been under pressure too long. The ceramic cup I'd been holding, my favorite, decorated with roses that Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary, slipped from my fingers and exploded against the linoleum floor. The sound surprised me with its violence. Pieces of painted porcelain scattered across the kitchen, and I stared at them through tears that came without warning. That cup had survived moves, dishwashers, decades of daily use, and countless moments of both joy and sorrow. It had held coffee during early morning conversations with Robert, tea during late-night worry sessions about the children, hot chocolate during snowy evenings when Sarah was small and still thought I was the most important person in her world. Now it was destroyed, irreplaceable, joining the growing collection of things in my life that couldn't be repaired. I sank onto the floor beside the broken pieces, my knees protesting the hard surface, and sobbed with a desperation I hadn't felt since Robert's funeral. But these tears were different. At Robert's funeral, I had grieved for love lost. Tonight, I was grieving for love that had never really existed. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to imagine saying no. No more money transfers. No more unquestioned trust. No more accepting crowbs of affection in exchange for financial support. No more pretending that being needed was the same as being loved. The thought terrified me. What would happen if I stopped being useful to Sarah? Would she disappear entirely? Would I lose access to my grandchildren? Would I spend my remaining years completely alone, forgotten by the family I had devoted my life to supporting? But as I sat on that cold kitchen floor, surrounded by fragments of something that had once been whole and beautiful, an even more frightening thought occurred to me: I was already alone. The relationship I thought I was preserving with my sacrifices wasn't real. The love I thought I was earning with my generosity was just a performance designed to keep the money flowing. The family I was afraid of losing had already decided I was expendable. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my armchair, staring out at the city lights and thinking about the life I had built versus the life I was actually living. For decades, I had told myself a story about being a devoted mother and grandmother whose sacrifices were creating security and closeness for the people I loved most. But the story Sarah was telling was completely different. In her version, I was a convenient resource, someone too naive and lonely to ask difficult questions, someone whose money could be redirected without consequences because I would never be brave enough to confront her. Which story was true? As dawn broke over Queens, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, I realized that both stories were true. But the question wasn't about truth, it was about which story I wanted to continue living. I made myself coffee as the city came alive around me, and for the first time in years, I didn't think about what Sarah might need from me that day. Instead, I thought about what I needed: respect, honesty, the freedom to spend my money on my own priorities without guilt or manipulation, the right to be seen as a person rather than a resource, the possibility of relationships based on genuine affection rather than financial convenience. As I sipped my coffee and watched my neighbor Marisol Martinez tending to her small herb garden on the fire escape across the courtyard, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start living my own story instead of being a supporting character in everyone else's. But first, I needed to know exactly how much damage had been done. That morning, instead of calling Sarah to check on the grandchildren as I did every Tuesday, I called the bank and asked them to send me detailed statements for all my accounts going back 5 years. Then I called my doctor and made an appointment to address the health problems I'd been ignoring while prioritizing everyone else's needs. Finally, I called the local senior center and asked about their legal assistance program. It was time to find out who Eleanor Margaret Murphy really was when she wasn't busy being taken advantage of. The phone rang around noon. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, probably wondering why I hadn't called with my usual check-in. For the first time in years, I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message, struck by how different it sounded when I wasn't desperate to accept whatever scraps of attention she was offering. "Hey Mom, just wanted to see how you're doing. Give me a call back when you get a chance, okay? Love you." The words were perfectly pleasant, perfectly normal. But I could hear what I'd been missing for years: the slight impatience in her tone, the formulaic nature of the message, the assumption that I would call back immediately because I always did. There was no real interest in how I was doing, no acknowledgement that she was the one who usually called me, no recognition that something might be different. That afternoon, I spent several hours going through boxes of old photos, letters, and documents. I was looking for evidence, but what I found was something more painful: a record of my own transformation from person to resource, documented in Sarah's own words. Christmas cards from the early years after Robert's death: "Thank you for everything you do for our family, Mom. We're so lucky to have someone who cares about us as much as you do." Birthday cards from a few years later: "Hope your special day is wonderful. Thanks for always being there when we need you." The most recent card I could find, from 2 years ago: "Happy birthday. Love, Sarah, Tom, Emma, and David." The evolution was clear. I had gone from someone who was appreciated for who I was to someone who was valued for what I provided to someone who was barely acknowledged at all. The emotional content of Sarah's communications had been systematically reduced until only the most basic social obligations remained. But even more revealing were the financial records I found mixed in with family photos. Receipts for money orders sent to Sarah's family. Copies of bank transfers. ATM withdrawal slips from times when Sarah needed cash quickly and I had provided it. The amounts were larger than I remembered, and the frequency was shocking. In the month before Robert died, I had loaned Sarah's family $200. By last month, a typical request was for $2,000, and the requests came twice as often. I had been trained so gradually that I hadn't noticed the training. Each slightly larger request had been presented as an exception, a one-time emergency that would never happen again. Each slightly cooler interaction had been explained by Sarah's increasing responsibilities and stress. Each slightly longer gap between communications had been justified by her busy life and my need to be more understanding. Looking at the progression laid out in black and white, I could see that I had been systematically conditioned to accept less respect while providing more resources. And the most insidious part was that Sarah had convinced me this was normal, even virtuous. I wasn't being exploited, I was being a generous mother. I wasn't being taken advantage of, I was helping family members who were struggling in a difficult economy. But the conversation I'd overheard shattered this protective narrative. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. She understood that I was afraid of being alone, and she was using that fear to maintain access to my money while minimizing the effort she had to put into our relationship. She had calculated the minimum amount of attention and affection necessary to keep me compliant, and she had been delivering exactly that amount, nothing more, nothing less. The next few days were a strange period of emotional numbness punctuated by moments of intense clarity. I went through my usual routines, grocery shopping, paying bills, tending to my plants, but everything felt different. Colors seemed more vivid. Sounds were sharper. I noticed things I had been too preoccupied to see for years. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman Sarah had described as clingy, was actually just friendly. When she asked about my health or commented on the weather, she wasn't being needy, she was being neighborly. Mr. Patterson, the man who supposedly wouldn't learn new technology, was perfectly capable of operating his smartphone. He just enjoyed having brief conversations with people when he asked for help with complex features. The grocery store clerk who Sarah found annoying was simply someone who took pride in providing good customer service and enjoyed connecting with regular customers. I began to suspect that Sarah's harsh judgments about other elderly people reflected her feelings about me. If she saw normal aging behaviors as burdensome and annoying in strangers, what must she think about my own increasing limitations? This realization coincided with the arrival of my bank statements, which confirmed my worst fears. In the past year alone, $37,000 had been transferred from my accounts to Sarah's family. Some transfers were ones I remembered approving, but many were not. The amounts and dates didn't match my memories of our conversations about emergencies and special needs. When I called the bank to ask about the discrepancies, the customer service representative explained that Sarah, as an authorized user on my accounts, could make transfers without my specific approval for each transaction. The paperwork I had signed 5 years ago essentially gave her power of attorney over my finances, though it hadn't been explained to me in those terms at the time. "Ma'am, if you want to modify these arrangements, you'll need to come in and fill out new forms. You can also remove authorized users entirely if you prefer to handle all transactions yourself." The representative spoke carefully, as if she suspected there might be a problem but couldn't say so directly. I wondered how often elderly customers called with similar questions, and how many of them were discovering that their trust had been systematically abused by family members. That evening, I tried to eat dinner but found I had no appetite. The small apartment that had always felt cozy now seemed cramped and airless. I opened the windows despite the cool March evening, letting in the sounds of the city along with fresh air that carried hints of spring. Somewhere in the distance, children were playing in a schoolyard, their laughter mixing with traffic sounds and the rumble of the subway. I thought about my grandchildren, Emma and David, and realized I hadn't seen them in almost 3 months. Sarah always had reasons why visits were difficult to arrange: school schedules, extracurricular activities, social commitments that couldn't be rescheduled. But looking back, I could see that my access to Emma and David had been carefully controlled, limited to occasions when Sarah needed something from me. Emma's 16th birthday party last year was a perfect example. I wasn't invited to the actual celebration, which Sarah explained was just a small thing with her closest friends. But I was asked to contribute to the cost of the party and to spend an afternoon helping with food preparation. When I asked if I could at least see Emma to wish her happy birthday in person, Sarah arranged a brief visit where Emma clearly felt obligated to thank me for the money and make polite conversation before returning to activities that didn't include me. David's hockey games were another controlled access point. Sarah would sometimes invite me to attend, but only when they needed someone to help with transportation or equipment. I was never included in post-game celebrations or family dinners afterward. My role was functional: drive David to practice, carry his gear, provide money for equipment, rather than emotional. I began to see that my relationships with my grandchildren had been carefully managed to maximize my financial contributions while limiting their emotional attachment to me. Sarah didn't want Emma and David to see me as a beloved grandmother whose opinions mattered and whose feelings deserved consideration. She wanted them to see me as a generous benefactor who occasionally attended their events and helped with expenses. This manipulation was subtle but devastating. Emma and David weren't particularly warm or communicative with me, but I had attributed this to normal teenage behavior and generational differences. Now I wondered if they had been taught to see me the way Sarah did, as someone whose value was measured by my willingness to provide money rather than by my wisdom, experience, or capacity for love. The thought of losing access to my grandchildren entirely was almost unbearable. But I was beginning to understand that I had never really had meaningful access to them in the first place. The relationship I thought we shared was as artificial as my relationship with Sarah, carefully constructed to serve her purposes rather than to nurture genuine family bonds. 3 days after overhearing that conversation, I decided to test my theory. Instead of sending Sarah's family the monthly transfer I had been providing since David started high school, I did nothing. I didn't announce that I was stopping the payments or demand explanations for anything. I simply waited to see what would happen when my usefulness came into question. Sarah called within a week, her voice tighter than usual. "Hi Mom, I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Are you feeling okay? You seem, I don't know, different lately." The concern was obviously manufactured. Sarah had no way of knowing whether I seemed different because she hadn't seen me in weeks and rarely called unless she needed something. But the missed transfer had apparently triggered some kind of alert system. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Just dealing with some usual old age stuff. Nothing too serious." "That's good. Listen, I noticed the transfer didn't go through this month. I was worried maybe you were having problems with the bank or something." There it was. Not, "How are you feeling?" or "Is there anything I can do to help?" but immediate focus on the missing money. Sarah had called within days of a missed transfer, but she hadn't called within weeks of our last actual conversation. "Oh, I've been meaning to call you about that," I said, testing how much honesty our relationship could tolerate. "I've been reviewing my expenses, and I'm not sure I can keep sending as much money as I have been. My healthcare costs are going up, and I want to make sure I have enough saved for my own needs." The silence that followed lasted long enough to make me wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had an edge I rarely heard directed at me. "Mom, this is really bad timing. David's registration fees are due next week, and Emma needs new textbooks for her spring classes. We've been counting on your help." Counting on my help. Not hoping for it, not grateful for it, but counting on it, as if my financial support was guaranteed income rather than voluntary assistance. The phrasing revealed everything about how Sarah saw our arrangement. "I understand that creates difficulties," I said, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Maybe this is a good time for us to sit down and talk about what I can realistically afford to help with going forward." Another silence, shorter this time but filled with tension. "Mom, are you sure you're feeling okay? This doesn't sound like you at all. Usually you want to help with everything, and now you're suddenly worried about money? Did someone tell you to cut us off?" The question was designed to make me defensive, to suggest that my newfound concern about my finances was really someone else's bad influence rather than my own rational decision. Sarah couldn't conceive that I might have developed independent concerns about being exploited. In her mind, I was either a willing participant in our financial arrangement or a victim of outside manipulation. "No one told me anything," I said. "I'm just getting older, and I need to be more careful about my spending." "Well, maybe we should come over and help you look at your budget. Sometimes elderly people get confused about their finances, and they start making decisions that don't really make sense." There it was, the implicit threat that I was becoming incompetent, that my desire to control my own money was a sign of mental decline rather than wisdom. Sarah was suggesting that she should take over my financial decision-making entirely, for my own protection of course. "That won't be necessary," I said. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own money." "I'm sure you are, Mom, but you've never been very good with numbers, and things are more complicated now than they used to be. It might be good to have someone younger look things over, just to make sure you're not missing anything important." The condescension was breathtaking. Sarah was rewriting history, pretending I hadn't successfully managed a household budget for decades, raised 2 children, and navigated the complex process of establishing the very trust fund she had been systematically draining. My mathematical abilities were apparently sufficient when they produced money for her family but insufficient when they produced questions about her spending. This conversation lasted another 20 minutes, with Sarah alternately expressing concern for my mental health and frustration with my new reluctance to provide unlimited financial support. She never asked about my physical health, my emotional well-being, or how I was spending my time. She never shared news about her own life or updates about the grandchildren's activities and accomplishments. The entire call was focused on re-establishing my willingness to send money without questions. When we finally hung up, I felt exhausted but also strangely clear. The conversation had stripped away any remaining illusions about what Sarah valued about our relationship. I wasn't her mother in any meaningful sense, I was her private bank, and she was frustrated that her access to funds had been temporarily suspended. That night, I called Marisol Martinez, my neighbor who had become the closest thing to a real friend in my life. Marisol was 68, a widow who had immigrated from Puerto Rico 30 years ago and built a life in Queens through sheer determination and hard work. She had raised 4 children mostly by herself after her husband died in a construction accident, and she had done it without family money or financial support from her grown children. Mija, she said when I told her about my situation, using the Spanish term of endearment that always made me feel valued in a way Sarah's English endearments no longer did. You know what your problem is? You think love is something you have to buy. We sat in her small kitchen, which was warm and bright and filled with the scent of the herbs she grew in coffee cans on her windowsill. Marisol made tea in mismatched cups and served it with homemade cookies that tasted like comfort itself. I raised 4 kids without ever giving them money they didn't earn, she continued. You know what they give me now? Respect. Time. Attention. My grandson calls me every Sunday just to tell me about his week. My daughter brings her problems to me because she values my opinion, not because she wants my wallet. But what if Sarah stopped speaking to me entirely? I asked, voicing the fear that had paralyzed me for years. Then you'll find out whether she ever loved you or just loved your money, Marisol said gently. And either way, you'll be better off knowing the truth. We talked until after midnight, and for the first time in years, I felt heard rather than managed. Marisol didn't offer to solve my problems or tell me what I should do. She listened to my concerns, validated my feelings, and shared her own experiences with family relationships that had required setting boundaries. The hardest thing about getting older, she told me, is learning that some people will try to convince you that you don't deserve respect anymore. They'll say it's because you're not useful, or because you're becoming a burden, or because you don't understand how the world works now. But it's all lies, Eleanor. You deserve respect because you're a human being with dignity and worth. When I finally went home, I felt different. Not completely transformed, but shifted in some fundamental way. For the first time in years, I fell asleep quickly and slept deeply, without the anxiety that usually kept me awake worrying about family problems I couldn't solve and financial obligations I couldn't meet. The next morning, I dressed carefully in my best pants and sweater, and took the subway to the bank where I had maintained accounts for over 20 years. The building was impersonal and intimidating, filled with young people in expensive suits who seemed to view elderly customers as obstacles to be processed efficiently rather than people deserving individual attention. But when I explained that I wanted to review all my accounts and modify the authorized user arrangements, the personal banker assigned to help me was surprisingly patient and thorough. She was a woman about Sarah's age with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made me feel less embarrassed about my lack of financial sophistication. Mrs. Murphy, she said after reviewing my statements, I want to make sure you understand what these changes will mean. If you remove your daughter as an authorized user, she'll no longer be able to make transfers or withdrawals without your explicit approval for each transaction. Is that what you want? Yes, I said, surprised by how firm my voice sounded. I want to control my own money. That's absolutely your right. Let me walk you through some options that might work well for your situation. Over the next hour, we restructured my accounts to provide security without completely cutting Sarah off from emergency access. I established clear limits on transfer amounts, required written authorization for transactions over a certain threshold, and set up separate accounts for my daily expenses versus long-term savings. Most importantly, I opened a new account that only I could access, and I transferred enough money to cover 6 months of living expenses into that protected space. For the first time since Robert died, I had financial security that couldn't be compromised by anyone else's decisions. When I left the bank, I felt lighter than I had in years. The simple act of asserting control over my own resources had restored something I hadn't realized I'd lost, a sense of personal agency, of being the author of my own story rather than a supporting character in everyone else's drama. But I knew that changing my banking arrangements was just the first step in a much larger transformation. The hardest part would be learning to navigate family relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency, and I wasn't sure Sarah would be willing or able to make that transition. My phone rang that evening, and Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it ring 4 times before answering, a small assertion of my right to decide when and whether to be available. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'm really worried about you. This sudden concern about money just isn't like you at all. I think maybe we should make an appointment for you to see a doctor, just to make sure everything is okay. The suggestion was phrased as concern, but the underlying message was clear: if I wasn't willing to continue providing unlimited financial support, there must be something wrong with my mental health. Sarah was suggesting that my desire to control my own money was a symptom of illness rather than a sign of returning sanity. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm perfectly healthy. I've just realized that I need to be more careful about my finances as I get older. But Mom, you've always been so generous with family. It's one of the things I've always admired about you. You taught me that family takes care of each other, no matter what. This was manipulation disguised as flattery. Sarah was trying to reframe my financial exploitation as a family value, something I should be proud of rather than concerned about. She was suggesting that my generosity was an essential part of my identity, and that changing my behavior would mean betraying my own principles. Family should take care of each other, I agreed. That's why I think it's time for you to start taking care of yourself financially. The silence that followed was so long I began to wonder if Sarah was considering hanging up. I don't understand what's gotten into you, she finally said, and for the first time in our conversation, she sounded genuinely emotional rather than strategically manipulative. We're struggling here, Mom. The economy is terrible, everything is so expensive, and we've been counting on your help to get through this difficult time. I thought you wanted to help your grandchildren have opportunities. I do want Emma and David to have opportunities, I said. But I also want them to learn that opportunities come from hard work and smart decisions, not from taking advantage of elderly family members. Taking advantage? Sarah's voice rose to a pitch I rarely heard from her. How can you say that? Everything we've asked for has been for legitimate expenses, school costs, medical bills, emergency repairs. We're not buying luxury items with your money. But I knew that wasn't entirely true, based on the social media photos and the inconsistencies I'd noticed between her claimed financial status and her actual lifestyle. More importantly, the legitimacy of individual expenses wasn't really the issue. The problem was the systematic nature of the requests, the lack of reciprocity in our relationship, and the way Sarah had trained me to provide money without expecting gratitude, accountability, or respect in return. I'm not saying you've used the money inappropriately, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I'm saying that our relationship has become unbalanced, and I think that's unhealthy for both of us. Unbalanced how? When did you last call me just to see how I was doing, without needing anything? Another long silence. I call you all the time, Mom. You call me when you need money, when you need babysitting, or when you need emotional support for your problems. When do you call to offer me emotional support, or just because you miss talking to me? That's not fair. You know I care about you. How would I know that, Sarah? What do you do that shows care rather than need? This question seemed to genuinely perplex her. In Sarah's mind, our relationship was perfectly normal. She had problems, I helped solve them, and this arrangement benefited everyone. The idea that I might have emotional needs of my own, or that our interactions might be missing something essential, apparently hadn't occurred to her. I don't know what you want me to say, Mom. I'm busy. I have a lot of responsibilities. I can't call you every day just to chat. I'm not asking you to call every day. I'm asking you to think about whether our relationship involves anything besides you needing things from me. That's not what our relationship is about. Then what is it about, Sarah? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that neither of us had a good answer. What was our relationship about, if not Sarah's needs and my resources? When had we last had a conversation about ideas, memories, dreams, fears, or any of the things that make relationships meaningful? When had we last laughed together, or shared a moment of genuine intimacy, or simply enjoyed each other's company? Look, Mom, I don't know what's brought this on, but I think you're making our relationship sound much worse than it actually is. We love each other. We're family. Sometimes families go through difficult periods, but that doesn't mean we stop helping each other. You're right that families help each other, I said. But help should go both ways. What do you do to help me, Sarah? I check on you. I make sure you're okay. When did you last check on me without needing something? I can't remember every conversation we've had, Mom. I can. Every call in the past 6 months has been about money, babysitting, or problems you wanted me to help solve. Not one has been about how I'm doing, what I'm thinking about, or whether there's anything you could do to make my life easier or happier. This conversation continued for another 30 minutes, getting increasingly circular and increasingly tense. Sarah seemed genuinely unable to understand my perspective, as if the possibility that I might have needs, feelings, and priorities of my own was a foreign concept. In her worldview, Elderly parents existed to provide support for their adult children, and any deviation from this role was selfish and unreasonable. When we finally hung up, I felt drained but also strangely proud of myself. I had articulated my concerns clearly, asked difficult questions, and refused to be manipulated by guilt or false concern. For the first time in years, I had spoken up for myself instead of just accepting whatever treatment I received. But I also knew that this conversation had probably made things worse rather than better. Sarah wasn't going to suddenly develop empathy or begin treating me with more respect. If anything, she was likely to increase her efforts to regain control over my decisions, probably by enlisting other family members to pressure me or by escalating her concerns about my mental health. Sure enough, my son Michael called from California 2 days later. "Mom, Sarah is really worried about you. She says you're acting strange and making financial decisions that don't make sense. Are you sure you're feeling okay?" Michael and I had always had a more distant relationship than Sarah and I, partly because of geography and partly because he was more like his father, loving but practical, caring but not emotionally expressive. He called on holidays and birthdays, sent thoughtful gifts, and generally treated me with consistent kindness and respect. But he had never been deeply involved in my daily life, and he had no real understanding of how my relationship with Sarah had evolved over the years. "I'm fine, Michael," I said. "I've just decided to be more careful about my spending. Sarah says you've suddenly stopped helping with the kids' expenses, and she's worried that someone might be taking advantage of you. You know, there are a lot of scams targeting elderly people now." This was fascinating. In Sarah's version of events, my decision to control my own money wasn't a sign of returning autonomy, it was evidence that I was being victimized by someone else. She couldn't conceive that I might have independent reasons for changing my behavior. "No one is taking advantage of me," I said. "I'm just reevaluating my priorities." "Well, that's good, but Sarah says you're also talking about your relationship in ways that sound, I don't know, paranoid? Like you think she's been using you or something?" The word paranoid hit me like a slap. Sarah had apparently told Michael that my concerns about our relationship were delusions, symptoms of mental decline rather than legitimate observations about how I'd been treated. She was using my son to reinforce the narrative that I was becoming incompetent and needed family oversight of my decisions. "I'm not paranoid, Michael. I'm just noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before." "What kind of things?" I wanted to explain everything: the one-sided nature of my communications with Sarah, the systematic draining of my accounts, the way I'd been trained to provide resources without expecting relationship reciprocity. But I realized that Michael didn't have the context to understand these concerns. He lived 3,000 miles away, called me once a month, and had never witnessed the daily dynamics that had gradually eroded my relationship with his sister. "I think Sarah and I have gotten into some unhealthy patterns," I said carefully. "I've been giving her family money regularly, and I think it's made our relationship too focused on financial issues rather than just enjoying each other's company." "Mom, there's nothing wrong with helping family when they're struggling. Dad would have wanted you to help us if we needed it." This was true, and it was also irrelevant. Robert would have wanted me to help our children in times of genuine need, but he wouldn't have wanted me to be systematically exploited under the guise of family support. The problem wasn't helping occasionally, it was the way helping had become my primary function within the family. "Robert would also have wanted our children to treat me with respect and consideration," I said. "He wouldn't have wanted me to feel like my value to the family depends entirely on my willingness to provide money." "I'm sure Sarah doesn't see it that way." "How does Sarah see it, Michael? When did she last do something for me that wasn't related to her own needs?" Michael couldn't answer this question, probably because he had no idea how Sarah and I actually interacted on a regular basis. From his distant perspective, our relationship looked normal, a devoted mother helping her struggling daughter get through difficult times. He couldn't see the subtle manipulation, the emotional withholding, or the way Sarah had systematically reduced my role in her life to that of financial provider. After we hung up, I realized that Sarah's strategy was working. By framing my concerns as symptoms of mental decline, she was enlisting family support for the idea that I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. If she could convince enough people that I was becoming incompetent, she might be able to regain legal control over my finances through guardianship proceedings or other legal mechanisms. This realization was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. I couldn't afford to approach this situation with the assumption that family members would eventually recognize the truth and support my autonomy. I needed to protect myself legally and financially, and I needed to do it quickly. The next morning, I called the senior center in my neighborhood and asked about their legal assistance program. The woman who answered was warm and knowledgeable, and she scheduled me for an appointment with an attorney who specialized in elder rights and family financial issues. "Mrs. Murphy," she said, "you're smart to be proactive about this. We see situations like yours more often than you might think, and the sooner you establish legal protections, the better off you'll be." That afternoon, I also called my doctor and scheduled a comprehensive physical and mental health evaluation. If Sarah was going to question my competency, I wanted medical documentation that I was mentally sharp and fully capable of making my own decisions. These steps felt simultaneously empowering and heartbreaking. I was taking control of my life, but I was also acknowledging that my own daughter had become someone I needed legal protection from. The mother who had once changed Sarah's diapers and sung her lullabies was now consulting lawyers about how to prevent Sarah from taking advantage of her. But as painful as this recognition was, it was also liberating. For years, I had been living in a state of constant anxiety about family relationships, always afraid I wasn't doing enough, giving enough, or being understanding enough. Now I was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't my inadequacy, it was my willingness to accept inadequate treatment. The appointment with the legal aid attorney was scheduled for the following week, but before I could get there, Sarah made her next move in what had become a chess game I'd never realized we were playing. She arrived at my apartment on a Saturday morning, unannounced, with Emma and David in tow. This was unusual because Sarah rarely brought the grandchildren to visit me, and she never dropped by without calling first. But there they were at my door, Sarah with a concerned expression, Emma looking uncomfortable, and David staring at his phone with the typical teenage indifference to adult drama. "Hi Mom," Sarah said, hugging me with more physical affection than she'd shown in months. We were in the neighborhood, and I thought it would be nice for the kids to spend some time with their grandmother. The gesture was clearly calculated. Sarah was demonstrating to the children that she was the caring daughter trying to maintain family relationships while I was the difficult grandmother who had been creating problems. Emma and David would witness whatever conversation followed, and their presence would make it harder for me to speak directly about our issues. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say with my grandchildren standing there? "Come in. I'll make some tea." We sat in my small living room, Emma perched on the edge of the sofa like she couldn't wait to leave, David completely absorbed in his phone, and Sarah radiating false cheerfulness. "So, Mom, I've been doing some research about financial planning for seniors, and I found some really helpful resources. I thought maybe we could look at them together and make sure you're set up for success." Sarah had brought a folder full of printouts about retirement planning, investment strategies, and estate management. The materials were legitimate and potentially useful, but the timing was transparently manipulative. She was positioning herself as the helpful daughter trying to assist her mother with complex decisions, rather than the person whose financial demands had created the need for those decisions in the first place. "That's thoughtful of you," I said carefully, "but I'm already working with professionals on my financial planning." "Oh, that's great. Who are you working with? Maybe I could talk to them too, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what's best for you." There it was, the assumption that Sarah should be included in conversations about my financial future, that my decisions needed her approval or oversight. She was trying to re-establish herself as a legitimate stakeholder in my financial planning, despite having just demonstrated that I couldn't trust her with access to my money. "I don't think that's necessary," I said. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "I know you are, Mom, but sometimes it's helpful to have family involved, especially as we get older. I just want to make sure you have all the support you need." Emma looked up from her phone at this point, probably sensing tension in the conversation. "Is Grandma okay?" she asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. "Grandma's fine, sweetheart," Sarah said quickly. "We're just talking about some boring grown-up stuff about money and planning for the future." But then Sarah turned to me with an expression I had never seen before, cold, calculating, and slightly threatening. "The thing is, Mom, I've been talking to some people about elderly financial abuse, and I learned that sometimes when seniors start making sudden changes to their spending patterns or banking arrangements, it can be a sign that someone is taking advantage of them. I'm just worried that maybe someone has been pressuring you to cut off your family." This was breathtaking in its audacity. Sarah was accusing me of being financially abused by unknown third parties in order to distract from her own systematic exploitation. She was turning the language of elder protection against me, using my own vulnerability as a weapon to maintain her access to my resources. "No one is pressuring me to do anything," I said, my voice shaking slightly with anger. "I'm making my own decisions based on my own observations." "What kinds of observations?" Sarah asked this question in front of Emma and David, clearly hoping I wouldn't be willing to discuss family financial issues in detail with the grandchildren present. She was using their presence as a shield, knowing I would hesitate to say anything that might upset them or damage their relationship with their mother. But I had reached a breaking point. The manipulation was too obvious, the stakes were too high, and I was tired of protecting Sarah from the consequences of her own behavior. I've observed that our relationship has become entirely one-sided, I said, looking directly at Sarah while trying to keep my voice calm for the children's sake. I give you money regularly, but you rarely call just to check on me. I help with emergencies, but when I have problems, you suggest I solve them independently. I've been supporting your family financially for years, but when I started asking questions about where the money was going, you immediately accused me of mental incompetence. Emma and David were now paying full attention, their phones forgotten, their eyes moving back and forth between their mother and me like spectators at a tennis match. Mom, that's not fair, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. I do care about you. I call you all the time. When did you last call me without needing money, babysitting, or emotional support for your problems? I asked, the same question I'd posed on the phone but now with witnesses present. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She couldn't answer because the answer was that she never called just to connect with me, and Emma and David were old enough to recognize the significance of her silence. Grandma, Emma said softly, is that true? Does Mom only call you when she needs something? The question hung in the air like smoke. Emma was 16, old enough to understand family dynamics, old enough to recognize exploitation when she saw it. David was 14, still somewhat self-absorbed but beginning to develop more sophisticated thinking about relationships and fairness. I think, I said carefully, that sometimes family relationships can get out of balance without anyone realizing it. Your mother loves you both very much, and she's been under a lot of stress trying to provide for your family. But somewhere along the way, our relationship became mostly about solving problems instead of just enjoying each other's company. This was diplomatic phrasing, designed to help Emma and David understand the situation without completely destroying their image of their mother. But it was also honest in a way that my conversations with Sarah had often failed to be. Sarah's face had gone pale, and I could see her calculating rapidly, trying to figure out how to regain control of a conversation that had spiraled beyond her management. Mom, I think you're making this sound much more dramatic than it needs to be. Every family goes through difficult periods. The important thing is that we love each other and work through our problems together. I agree, I said. But working through problems together requires both people to acknowledge that problems exist. For months, I've been trying to talk to you about feeling taken for granted, and your response has been to suggest that I'm mentally incompetent. I never said you were incompetent. You told Michael that I was acting paranoid. You suggested I needed medical evaluation because I wanted to control my own money. You brought materials about senior financial planning as if I was incapable of handling my own affairs. What would you call that? Emma was looking at her mother with an expression I'd never seen before, not defiance, exactly, but a kind of analytical assessment that suggested she was re-evaluating everything she thought she knew about our family dynamics. Mom, Emma said, addressing Sarah, do you really only call Grandma when you need something? Of course not, Emma. Grandma and I talk all the time. But Grandma just asked you when you called her last without needing anything, and you couldn't answer. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the brutal clarity that teenagers sometimes bring to adult self-deception. She had identified the central issue, Sarah's inability to cite a single instance of calling me for reasons that weren't utilitarian, and she had done it without accusation or judgment, just observation. Sarah looked at Emma with an expression of betrayal, as if her daughter had switched sides in a war she hadn't known they were fighting. Grandma is exaggerating, Sarah said, but her voice lacked confidence. We have a normal relationship. Every family has some challenges. But Grandma lives alone, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she worked through the implications. She doesn't have anyone else to talk to during the day. If you only call her when you need something, then she probably feels pretty lonely most of the time. This insight was so accurate, so perceptive, that I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. Emma had understood something that had taken me years to articulate clearly, the deep isolation that comes from being valued only for your utility rather than your companionship. David, who had been silent throughout the conversation, suddenly looked up from his phone. Wait, he said, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent awkwardness. Are you guys saying that Mom has been taking money from Grandma and not being nice to her? The question was almost comically direct, reducing complex family dynamics to their essential elements with the bluntness that only teenage boys can achieve. But it was also devastatingly accurate. It's more complicated than that, David, Sarah said quickly. How is it more complicated? Either you take money from grandma and treat her well, or you take money from grandma and don't treat her well. Which one is it? I had underestimated my grandchildren. At 14 and 16, Emma and David were old enough to understand fairness, reciprocity, and respect. They were also old enough to recognize when adults were being dishonest about relationship dynamics. Their questions were forcing Sarah to confront the reality of how she had been treating me, without the protective buffer of adult euphemisms and rationalizations. Sarah looked around the room desperately, probably realizing that her strategy of using the children as shields had backfired spectacularly. Instead of preventing difficult conversations, their presence had made the truth impossible to avoid. "Look," she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge that appeared when she felt cornered, "this is between your grandmother and me. It's not appropriate for you kids to be involved in adult financial discussions." "But you brought us here," Emma pointed out. "You made this conversation happen in front of us. I brought you here to spend time with your grandmother, not to have a family fight." "Then why did you bring all those papers about grandma's money?" David asked, gesturing toward the financial planning materials Sarah had placed on my coffee table. Sarah had no good answer for this question. She had clearly planned to use the children's presence to pressure me into accepting her involvement in my financial planning, but she hadn't anticipated that they would start asking their own questions about our relationship dynamics. "I think," I said gently, "that this conversation might be easier if we adults talked privately." "No," Emma said, surprising everyone. "I want to understand what's been happening." "Grandma, have you been giving us money for school and stuff?" I looked at Sarah, giving her a chance to answer her daughter's question honestly. When she remained silent, I decided that Emma and David deserved the truth. "Yes," I said. "I've been helping with school expenses, sports equipment, and other costs for several years." "How much money?" David asked. "David, that's not your business," Sarah said sharply. "It kind of is my business if it's money for my stuff," David replied. "And if grandma is giving us money but mom isn't being nice to her, then I don't want the money." The simplicity of David's moral reasoning was stunning. At 14, he could see clearly what his mother had spent years obscuring, that taking someone's money while treating them poorly was wrong, regardless of family relationships or financial need. Emma was nodding in agreement. "If mom has been mean to you, grandma, then we don't want your money either. That's not fair." I felt a surge of love and pride for my grandchildren that was unlike anything I had experienced in years. These young people, who I had worried might be lost to me if I stopped providing financial support, were demonstrating more integrity and empathy than their mother had shown in years. "You don't understand," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly with panic. "Grandma hasn't been mean to me. We've had some disagreements about money, but that doesn't mean I don't care about her." "Then when did you last do something nice for grandma that wasn't about money?" Emma asked, echoing my earlier questions with the persistence of a teenager who had identified an inconsistency and wasn't going to let it go. Sarah stood up abruptly, clearly realizing that this conversation was not going in her favor. "I think we should go," she said. "This isn't the kind of conversation we should be having in front of the children." But Emma and David didn't move. They were looking at me with expressions of concern and affection that I hadn't seen in years, and I realized that my honesty had created a connection with them that had been missing from our carefully managed interactions. "Grandma," Emma said, "are you lonely?" The question was simple, direct, and devastating. Emma had cut through all the complications and rationalizations to identify the core issue, my profound isolation within my own family. "Sometimes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's really sad," David said, and his matter-of-fact delivery somehow made the observation more powerful than any dramatic declaration could have been. "We should visit you more," Emma said. "Without mom, I mean. Just to hang out and talk." "That would be wonderful," I said, feeling lighter than I had in months. Sarah was staring at her children as if they had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. In her worldview, family loyalty meant supporting parents unconditionally, not questioning their behavior or forming independent relationships with grandparents. Emma and David's willingness to think critically about family dynamics was apparently shocking to her. "We're leaving," Sarah announced, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I don't want to leave," Emma said. "I want to stay and talk to grandma some more." "Mom, can we come visit grandma by ourselves sometimes?" David asked. "Like, just take the subway over here and hang out?" The questions revealed how isolated I had become from my own grandchildren. They had to ask permission to visit me independently, suggesting that their access to me had been carefully controlled and limited. But they also revealed a desire for connection that went beyond the orchestrated visits that had served Sarah's purposes. "That would be wonderful," I said again, looking at Sarah to gauge her reaction. Her face was frozen in an expression of barely controlled fury. She had come to my apartment planning to reassert control over my decisions, and instead she had lost control of her own children's perceptions of our family dynamics. Emma and David had seen through her manipulations with the clarity that sometimes comes from youth and inexperience with adult self-deception. "Fine," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "But we're going home now, and we're going to have a family discussion about what's appropriate and what isn't." She gathered up her financial planning materials and headed toward the door with rapid, angry movements. Emma and David followed reluctantly, but Emma paused at the door to hug me tightly. "I'm sorry Mom hasn't been nice to you," she whispered in my ear. "That's not okay." David hugged me too, awkwardly but sincerely. "We'll come visit you soon, Grandma. Just us." After they left, I sat in my small living room feeling stunned by what had just happened. In trying to manipulate me through my grandchildren, Sarah had inadvertently revealed the truth about our relationship to the very people she was hoping to use as leverage. Emma and David had seen the exploitation clearly, condemned it immediately, and offered genuine affection without conditions or complications. My phone rang an hour later. Sarah's name on the caller ID, and I knew the conversation would be unpleasant. "How could you do that to me in front of my children?" she demanded without preamble. "I didn't do anything to you." I answered their questions honestly. "You turned them against me. You made me look like a terrible daughter who doesn't care about her mother." "I didn't make you look like anything, Sarah." Emma and David drew their own conclusions based on the information available to them. They're children. They don't understand complex family dynamics. They understand fairness and reciprocity better than you do, apparently. The words came out sharper than I had intended, but I was reaching the end of my patience with Sarah's inability to accept responsibility for her own behavior. "That's not fair, Mom. I've been under tremendous stress trying to provide for my family. I'm sorry if I haven't been as attentive as you would like, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you." Caring isn't a feeling, Sarah. It's actions. What have you done that demonstrates care for me rather than need for me? Again, she couldn't answer the question. The silence stretched between us until Sarah finally spoke again, her voice cold and distant. "I can see that you've made up your mind to be bitter about everything I've ever done for you and to focus only on what you think I haven't done. If that's how you want to remember our relationship, there's nothing I can do about it." This was classic manipulation, reframing my legitimate concerns as bitterness and my desire for reciprocity as unreasonable expectations. Sarah was positioning herself as the victim of my ingratitude rather than acknowledging that there were real problems in how she had been treating me. "I'm not bitter," I said. "I'm finished accepting treatment that doesn't reflect my value as a person." "Fine. Then I guess you won't be sending any more money, and we won't be calling to bother you with our problems anymore." The threat was implicit but clear: if I demanded respect, I would lose access to my family entirely. Sarah was betting that my fear of abandonment would override my desire for dignity, just as it had for years. But something had changed during that conversation with Emma and David. Seeing myself through their eyes, as someone deserving of kindness and consideration, had reminded me that I had worth beyond my utility to others. Their immediate condemnation of Sarah's behavior had validated my own perceptions and given me strength to stand up for myself. "That's your choice to make," I said. "But if you do decide to cut contact with me, Emma and David will be old enough to understand exactly why that happened." It was my turn to make an implicit threat, and Sarah understood it immediately. Her children had already seen through her manipulation once. If she followed through on cutting me off, they would understand that she had chosen financial convenience over maintaining a relationship with their grandmother. "This conversation is over," Sarah said, and hung up. I spent the rest of that evening in a strange state of emotional suspension. The confrontation had been painful but also liberating. For the first time in years, I had spoken my truth clearly and stood my ground when challenged. I had discovered that my grandchildren were capable of forming independent judgments about family relationships and that their judgments aligned with my own perceptions. But I had also probably triggered a major escalation in my conflict with Sarah. She would not accept being challenged by her children or losing control over my decisions without a fight. I needed to be prepared for whatever she might do next. 3 days later, I found out exactly what Sarah was willing to do to regain control over the situation. I was returning from my appointment with the legal aid attorney when I saw Sarah's car parked outside my building and Sarah herself standing near the entrance talking to Mrs. Rodriguez and 2 other neighbors I recognized from the building. The conversation appeared intense and concerned, with lots of pointed looks in my direction as I approached. "Oh, there she is now," Sarah said as I walked up, her voice carrying that artificially bright tone she used when performing concern for public audiences. Hello, Mom, she continued, hugging me with exaggerated warmth. I was just talking to your lovely neighbors about how worried we all are about you. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at me with an expression of confused sympathy. Mija, your daughter says you've been having some problems with your thinking lately? She's concerned that someone might be taking advantage of you. The strategy was brilliant and devastating. Sarah was enlisting my neighbors, people who saw me daily and cared about my welfare, in her campaign to convince everyone that my desire for autonomy was actually a sign of mental decline. She was creating a narrative in which she was the devoted daughter trying to protect her vulnerable mother from exploitation. I'm perfectly fine, I said, but I could see that my protests looked exactly like what they would expect from someone who was being manipulated and didn't realize it. Of course you feel fine, Mom, Sarah said with practiced patience. But sometimes when we get older, we might not notice changes in our thinking, or we might trust people we shouldn't trust. That's why it's important to have family involved in important decisions. Mr. Patterson from the third floor had joined the group. My sister went through something similar, he said sadly. She started giving money to strangers who called her on the phone, and she got very angry when we tried to help. It's more common than you might think. I realized I was trapped in a perfect catch, 22. The more I insisted that I was mentally competent, the more I would sound like someone whose judgment was compromised. The more I protested Sarah's characterization of our relationship, the more I would seem paranoid and confused. Sarah had created a situation where any response I gave would reinforce her narrative. I appreciate everyone's concern, I said carefully, but I'm not giving money to strangers. I'm just being more careful about my spending. But Mom, Sarah said, her voice heavy with false sorrow, you've been saying some very strange things about our family. You seem to think that I only contact you when I need money, which just isn't true. I'm worried that someone might be filling your head with ideas about family members taking advantage of you. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. Oh, Mija, that's exactly what happened to my friend Maria. Someone convinced her that her son was stealing from her, and she nearly cut off contact with her whole family before we figured out what was really going on. I looked around at the small group of neighbors and realized that Sarah had successfully reframed my situation as a typical case of elder abuse by outsiders. They were seeing me as a vulnerable victim who needed protection, not as someone making rational decisions about toxic family dynamics. Sarah, I said, knowing I needed to find a way out of this public intervention, perhaps we could continue this conversation privately? Of course, Mom. I just wanted to make sure your neighbors knew to keep an eye out for anyone who might be pressuring you. We all want to make sure you're safe. As we walked toward the building entrance, I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez and the others talking quietly behind us, expressing concern for my situation and admiration for Sarah's devotion. Sarah had accomplished exactly what she'd intended, creating a network of community surveillance designed to monitor my behavior and report back any signs that I was making decisions her friends and family didn't approve of. Once we were inside my apartment, Sarah's mask of public concern dissolved immediately. I hope you're happy with what you've accomplished, she said, her voice tight with anger. Emma and David have been asking me all kinds of questions about our relationship, and they're starting to think I'm some kind of monster. I'm sorry they're upset, I said, but maybe this is an opportunity for you to think about how you've been treating me. How I've been treating you. Mom, I've been working full-time, raising 2 teenagers, managing a household, and dealing with financial stress, and somehow I'm also supposed to call you every day just to chat? That's not realistic. I never asked you to call every day. I asked you to call sometimes without needing anything from me. Fine. You want me to call just to talk? Let's talk. What do you want to talk about? Your health problems? Your complaints about the neighbors? Your loneliness? Because honestly, Mom, those conversations are depressing, and I already have enough stress in my life without taking on your emotional problems too. The honesty was brutal but also clarifying. Sarah saw my emotional needs not as opportunities for connection but as burdens that she shouldn't have to bear. In her mind, a good daughter provided financial assistance when asked and received financial assistance when needed, but emotional support was optional and inconvenient. So our relationship is purely transactional? I asked. All relationships are transactional to some extent. We help each other when we can, and we try not to be too demanding when we can't. That's how families work. That's not how families work, Sarah. That's how businesses work. Well, maybe modern families are more like businesses than the traditional families you grew up with. We're all busy, we all have responsibilities, and we have to be practical about what we can realistically expect from each other. This worldview explained everything about how Sarah had been treating me. In her mind, our relationship was essentially a business partnership in which I provided financial services and she provided minimal social contact in return. Emotional intimacy, mutual support, and genuine care were unrealistic expectations left over from an earlier era when people had more time and fewer responsibilities. What about Emma and David? I asked. Do you want them to see you as a practical business partner? Or do you want them to love and respect you? That's different. They're my children. And I'm your mother. Why is it different? Sarah looked at me as if the question was nonsensical. Because children are supposed to love their parents unconditionally. Parents are supposed to help their adult children succeed in life. Those are the natural roles. What about adult children loving their elderly parents? Of course I love you, Mom. But love doesn't mean I have unlimited time and energy to devote to your emotional needs. I have to prioritize my immediate family. I am your immediate family. You're my extended family. Emma and David and Tom are my immediate family. I stared at her, stunned by the casual brutality of this redefinition. In Sarah's mind, I had been demoted from immediate family member deserving of care and consideration to extended family member who ranked somewhere below her husband and children in terms of priority and attention. When did I become extended family? I asked. When I got married and had children of my own. That's how it works, Mom. People grow up and form their own nuclear families, and their original families become less central to their daily lives. Less central, maybe. But not irrelevant. Not purely utilitarian. I never said you were irrelevant. Then what am I, Sarah? What role do I play in your life besides providing money when you need it? She thought about this question for a long moment, and I could see her struggling to come up with an answer that didn't sound completely heartless. You're my mother, she finally said. You're someone I care about and worry about. You're someone I want to see happy and healthy and safe. But you don't want to spend time with me unless you need something? I don't have unlimited free time to spend with anyone, Mom. My life is incredibly busy and stressful, and I have to make choices about how to use my time and energy. And those choices consistently prioritize everyone except me? That's not true. I make time for you when I can. When you need something. You make time for me when you need something. Stop saying that. It makes me sound terrible. I'm not trying to make you sound terrible, Sarah. I'm trying to understand what our relationship actually is, as opposed to what I thought it was. We talked for another hour, going around in circles, with Sarah consistently deflecting my concerns and refusing to acknowledge that there was anything problematic about how she had been treating me. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why I might want emotional connection for its own sake, rather than as part of a broader exchange of services and obligations. When she finally left, she paused at the door with one final attempt at manipulation. I hope you'll think about what Emma and David need from their grandmother, she said. They love you, and it would be terrible if your issues with me ended up affecting your relationship with them. The threat was clear: if I continued to challenge Sarah's behavior, she would limit my access to my grandchildren. But I remembered Emma and David's reaction to learning about our relationship dynamics, and I realized that Sarah's threat might not be as powerful as she thought. My grandchildren were developing their own sense of justice and fairness, and they had already demonstrated that they wouldn't support their mother's exploitation of me. That evening, I called Emma directly for the first time in years. I had always gone through Sarah to communicate with my grandchildren, accepting her control over my access to them as natural and appropriate. But Emma was 16 years old enough to manage her own relationships, and I decided to test whether she actually wanted more independent contact with me. Hi, Grandma, she said, sounding pleased but slightly surprised. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to call and talk to you without it being part of a bigger family situation. Oh, that's nice. I was hoping you would call. I've been thinking about what happened the other day, and I wanted to ask you some things. We talked for over an hour about school, friends, her thoughts about college, and her observations about family dynamics. Emma was insightful, articulate, and genuinely interested in my perspectives on various topics. She asked thoughtful questions about my childhood, my marriage to her grandfather, and my experiences navigating changes in the neighborhood over the years. Most importantly, she didn't ask for anything. The conversation was purely social, based on mutual interest and affection rather than need or obligation. It was the kind of interaction I had been craving with Sarah for years, connection for its own sake, rather than as a prelude to requests for assistance. Grandma, Emma said near the end of our call, I think Mom has been really unfair to you. David and I talked about it, and we both want to spend more time with you. Would it be okay if we came to visit you sometimes without Mom? I would love that, I said, feeling tears of happiness rather than sadness for the first time in months. Cool. We can take the subway over this weekend if you want. After we hung up, I realized that Sarah's manipulation had backfired completely. In trying to use Emma and David as weapons against my autonomy, she had created an opportunity for me to form independent relationships with them. They had seen through her behavior, condemned it, and offered me the genuine affection that she had been withholding. But I also knew that Sarah would not accept this development without a fight. She would escalate her efforts to regain control over the situation, and I needed to be prepared for whatever she might try next. Sure enough, 2 days later I received a phone call from Adult Protective Services. "Mrs. Murphy, we've received a report expressing concern about your welfare. The caller indicated that you might be experiencing financial exploitation by unknown individuals, and that your family is worried about changes in your mental state. We'd like to schedule a visit to assess your situation and make sure you have access to appropriate resources." The call was professional and respectful, but I understood immediately what had happened. Sarah had reported me to social services as a vulnerable adult being exploited by outsiders, creating an official record that would support her narrative about my mental competence and need for family oversight. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not being exploited by anyone. I'm managing my own finances and making my own decisions." "That may well be the case, Mrs. Murphy, but we still need to complete an assessment when we receive reports of this nature. It's just a precaution to make sure you're safe and have access to support services you might need." The social worker who visited me the following week was kind, thorough, and professional. She asked detailed questions about my daily routine, my financial management, my social connections, and my decision-making processes. She reviewed my medical records, bank statements, and legal documents. She interviewed me extensively about my relationship with Sarah and my reasons for wanting to limit her access to my accounts. "Mrs. Murphy," she said after completing her assessment, "I want to be very clear about my findings. You are mentally competent, physically capable of independent living, and making rational decisions about your financial and personal affairs. There is no evidence of exploitation by outside parties, and your desire to control your own money is completely appropriate." I felt a surge of relief so intense I almost cried. "However," she continued, "I am concerned about some aspects of your family relationships that you've described. What you're experiencing sounds less like a loving family going through a difficult period and more like financial abuse by a family member." She provided me with resources for legal assistance, financial planning services, and support groups for elderly adults dealing with family exploitation. She also documented her findings in a report that would become part of my official record, providing legal protection against future claims that I was mentally incompetent. "Your daughter may not be happy about my conclusions," she warned. "People who are accustomed to controlling elderly family members often escalate their behavior when that control is challenged. I want you to call me immediately if you experience any threats, intimidation, or other concerning behavior." That afternoon, Sarah called me, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you tell social services that I've been abusing you? Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation? What it could do to my job? What if the school district finds out that I'm under investigation for elder abuse?" "I didn't report you to anyone," I said. "You reported me, remember? I reported that you might be being taken advantage of by strangers. I was trying to protect you. And instead, the social worker concluded that I'm being taken advantage of by you." This silenced Sarah for a moment, probably because she hadn't anticipated that her own report might be turned against her. "She doesn't understand our family dynamics," Sarah finally said. "She's a stranger who doesn't know anything about our history or our relationship. She understands financial exploitation when she sees it. I have never exploited you financially. Everything I've asked for has been for legitimate family expenses. Sarah, over the past 3 years, I've given your family $60,000. $60,000 that I saved by working 2 jobs as a widow in my 70s. How much of that money have you paid back? You didn't loan us that money, Mom. You gave it to us. There was never any expectation of repayment. There was an expectation of gratitude, respect, and reciprocity. There was an expectation that if I was supporting your family financially, you would at least treat me like someone whose feelings mattered. I do treat you with respect." "When, Sarah? When do you treat me with respect? When you ignore my birthday? When you interrupt me during phone conversations to deal with other priorities? When you suggest I'm mentally incompetent because I want to control my own money? When you bring financial planning materials to my apartment as if I'm incapable of managing my own affairs?" Each example I cited was met with silence, because Sarah couldn't deny the basic facts of how she had been treating me. "You're twisting everything to make me sound like a monster," she finally said. "I'm not twisting anything. I'm just describing what actually happened. Fine. If that's how you want to remember everything, then maybe we do need some space from each other. Maybe we do. The words came out more easily than I had expected, and I realized that I was no longer afraid of losing contact with Sarah. The social worker's validation of my experiences had given me confidence that my perceptions were accurate, and Emma and David's support had shown me that meaningful family relationships were still possible. And just so we're clear, Sarah continued, if you're cutting us off financially, then we can't afford the extra expenses anymore. Emma's college fund, David's sports equipment, the help with groceries and utilities, all of that stops if your money stops. I understand. Emma's going to have to take out student loans. David might have to quit hockey. We might have to move to a smaller apartment. Sarah was listing these consequences as if they were punishments for my refusal to continue being exploited. In her mind, the solution to her family's financial problems was my continued willingness to subsidize their lifestyle rather than their need to adjust their spending or increase their income. Those are decisions you'll have to make based on your own resources and priorities, I said. So you don't care if your grandchildren have to give up opportunities because you've decided to be selfish with your money? I care very much about Emma and David's opportunities. But I also care about teaching them that opportunities should be earned through hard work and family relationships should be based on love rather than financial dependency. That's easy to say when you don't have children to support. I supported 2 children for 30 years, Sarah. I did it without asking my parents for money, and I did it while treating them with respect and consideration. This conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah alternating between guilt trips, threats, and desperate attempts to convince me that her treatment of me had been normal and appropriate. When we finally hung up, I felt drained but also strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, I had stood up for myself completely. I had articulated my boundaries clearly, refused to be manipulated by false guilt, and accepted the possibility of losing relationships that weren't actually nourishing me. The conversation had been painful, but it had also been liberating. That weekend, Emma and David visited me as promised, taking the subway from their home in Manhattan to my apartment in Queens. They arrived carrying a small potted plant and homemade cookies, gifts that seemed more thoughtful than anything I had received from Sarah in years. We wanted to bring you something nice, Emma explained, since you've been giving us money for so long and we never really thanked you properly. You don't need to thank me with gifts, I said. Just spending time with me is wonderful. We spent the afternoon talking, playing cards, and looking through old photo albums. Emma was fascinated by pictures of my childhood and young adulthood, asking detailed questions about what life was like when I was her age. David, initially reluctant to engage with anything that didn't involve technology, gradually became interested in stories about his grandfather and the neighborhood where I had lived as a young married woman. Most importantly, neither of them asked for anything. They weren't visiting me because they needed money, transportation, or solutions to problems. They were visiting because they enjoyed my company and wanted to maintain a relationship with me. Grandma, David said as they were getting ready to leave, are you going to be okay without giving us money anymore? I mean, are you going to have enough for yourself? The question was so thoughtful, so mature, that I felt my heart swell with pride and love for this young man who was developing into someone with genuine character and empathy. I'll be fine, sweetheart. Actually, I'll be better than fine, because now I can spend my money on things I enjoy instead of worrying about other people's expenses all the time. Like what? Emma asked. Well, I've been thinking about taking some art classes. And maybe traveling a little bit. I haven't been anywhere in years because I was always worried about having money available for family emergencies. Emma and David looked at each other with an expression I couldn't quite read. That sounds really cool, Emma said. You should totally do that. Would you send us pictures if you go somewhere interesting? David asked. Of course I would. After they left, I reflected on how different this visit had been from our previous interactions. Before, my time with Emma and David had always felt slightly artificial, as if we were all playing roles in a family drama rather than simply enjoying each other's company. Now, our conversation felt natural and genuine, based on mutual interest rather than orchestrated obligation. But I also knew that Sarah would not be happy about their independent visit to me, and I braced myself for her response. Sure enough, she called that evening, her voice tight with controlled anger. The kids said they visited you today. Yes, we had a lovely time. I wish you had checked with me first. I like to know where they are, especially when they're using public transportation. They're 16 and 14, Sarah. They're old enough to visit their grandmother independently. That's not the point. The point is that you're undermining my authority as their parent by encouraging them to make plans without checking with me first. This was rich, coming from someone who had brought them to my apartment unannounced when it served her purposes. Sarah's concern about parental authority was really concern about losing control over my access to Emma and David. "I'm not undermining anything," I said. "I'm developing independent relationships with my grandchildren, which is normal and healthy. It's not normal to turn children against their mother." "I haven't turned anyone against you." Emma and David formed their own opinions based on their own observations. "You told them I was a bad daughter." I answered their questions honestly about our relationship. "If that makes you look bad, the problem isn't my honesty. They're children, Mom. They don't understand complex adult relationships. When you complain to them about me, they take your side because they love you and they want to make you feel better. But they don't understand the full picture. What part of the full picture justifies treating me the way you've been treating me?" Sarah couldn't answer this question, just as she had been unable to answer similar questions throughout our recent conflicts. "I don't want them visiting you alone anymore," she said finally. "That's between you and them. But they're old enough to make their own decisions about family relationships. They're not old enough to make decisions that could affect their futures. What if you decide to change your will because of things they say? What if you cut them out of your estate because they don't visit enough or because they take my side in family arguments?" This possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it revealed something important about how Sarah saw my relationships with Emma and David. In her mind, my affection for them was just as transactional as my relationship with her, contingent on their behavior and subject to withdrawal if they disappointed me. "I would never use my will to manipulate my grandchildren," I said. "My estate planning is based on what I think is best for them in the long term, not on whether they meet my emotional needs in the short term." "But you might change your mind if they disappoint you." "Do you change your mind about loving them when they disappoint you?" "That's different. I'm their mother. And I'm their grandmother. The love doesn't come with conditions just because I'm older." This conversation revealed another layer of Sarah's worldview. She assumed that elderly people were inherently manipulative, using money and inheritance as weapons to control family members. She couldn't conceive that I might support Emma and David's independence and encourage them to form their own opinions about family relationships because I loved them unconditionally. We argued for another 30 minutes, with Sarah demanding that I respect her parental authority by clearing future visits with Emma and David through her first, and me insisting that they were old enough to maintain independent relationships with their grandmother. When we finally hung up, I realized that this conflict was about much more than scheduling visits. It was about whether my grandchildren would be allowed to see me as a person worthy of respect and affection, or whether they would be trained to see me the way Sarah did, as a resource to be managed and eventually discarded. 3 days later, I received a text message from Emma that changed everything. "Grandma, I found something I think you should see. Can I come over after school tomorrow?" When Emma arrived the next afternoon, she looked serious and older than her 16 years. She was carrying her backpack and a manila folder, and her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by an expression of concern and determination. "Grandma, I need to show you something, but I want you to know that I wasn't snooping. I was looking for my birth certificate in Mom's filing cabinet for a college application, and I found this by accident." She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, bank statements, transfer records, and what appeared to be correspondence with people I didn't recognize. "I think Mom has been lying to you about where your money was going," Emma said, her voice shaking slightly. "And I think she's been lying to us too." The documents Emma had found revealed the full scope of Sarah's deception. The money I had been sending to support Emma and David's education and activities had been systematically redirected to other purposes. Some of it had gone to home improvements and luxury purchases that Sarah had hidden from me. But most troubling were the records showing large cash payments to individuals with names that matched the voices I had overheard in Sarah's conversation with her neighbor. Miguel Santos, Carlos Rivera, Ana Gutierrez, the people Sarah had casually referred to as illegals, had apparently been receiving regular payments from my money, financed through the trust fund I had established for my grandchildren's futures. "Emma," I said quietly, "do you understand what these papers mean?" "I think so. Mom was supposed to use your money for our school stuff, but instead she was giving it to other people and lying to you about it." "Do you know who these people are?" "I think they're the cleaning crew Mom hired for her office building. She got a contract to provide janitorial services for some businesses in Manhattan, and these are the people who actually do the work." The revelation was staggering. Sarah hadn't just been stealing my money, she had been using it to fund a business venture that she had hidden from me entirely. The illegal immigrants she had spoken about so dismissively were apparently employees in a cleaning service she was running on the side, and she was paying them with money she had taken from her children's education fund. "Does your mother know you found these papers?" I asked. No, but she'll probably notice they're missing eventually. I made copies of everything before I brought them to you. Emma was more mature and resourceful than I had given her credit for. At 16, she had understood the significance of what she had discovered, made copies for evidence, and brought the information to me despite knowing it would cause serious problems for her mother. Emma, why are you showing me this? You could have just put the papers back and pretended you never saw them. Because it's not right, she said, her voice growing stronger. You've been giving us money because you love us and you want to help with school, and Mom has been stealing it to pay for her business. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to us either. What do you mean? David and I thought you were paying for our stuff, so we felt guilty every time we needed something expensive. Like when I needed a new laptop for school, I felt terrible asking because I knew it meant you would have to send more money to Mom. But now I find out the money wasn't even going to my laptop anyway, it was going to Mom's secret business. I hadn't realized that Emma and David were carrying emotional burdens related to my financial support. They had been feeling guilty about accepting help for their education, not knowing that their education wasn't actually what my money was funding. There's something else, Emma continued, pulling out additional papers. I think Mom has been taking money from your accounts without asking. Look at these bank statements. The statements Emma showed me documented transfers from my accounts that I had never authorized. The amounts were smaller than the regular payments Sarah had been requesting directly, but they added up to thousands of dollars over several months. How did you get these? I asked. They were in the same folder. I think Mom has been getting copies of your bank statements somehow. This was the most disturbing revelation yet. Sarah hadn't just been manipulating me into giving her money, she had also been stealing money directly from my accounts, using whatever access she had gained when I authorized her as an account beneficiary years earlier. I spent the next hour looking through all the papers Emma had found, trying to understand the full scope of Sarah's deception. The picture that emerged was devastating. Over the past year, she had taken at least $15,000 from my accounts without my knowledge, redirected another $20,000 from the legitimate expenses she had claimed to need help with, and used all of this money to fund a business venture that could potentially be quite profitable. Emma, I said, this is evidence of serious financial crimes. If I report this to the police, your mother could be arrested. Emma's face went pale, but her expression remained determined. I know. But what she did was still wrong, even if she is my mom. The moral clarity of the 16-year-old was remarkable. Emma understood that family relationships didn't excuse criminal behavior, and she was willing to face the consequences of exposing her mother's crimes in order to protect me from continued exploitation. What does David think about all this? I asked. He doesn't know yet. I wanted to talk to you first before I told him. But I think he'll feel the same way I do. We love Mom, but she shouldn't be stealing from our grandmother. That evening, after Emma went home, I sat in my apartment staring at the evidence she had brought me and trying to decide what to do next. The papers proved that Sarah had been systematically defrauding me for months, using my emotional attachment to my grandchildren as cover for theft that could have left me financially vulnerable in my old age. But they also created a legal and moral dilemma. If I reported Sarah to the police, Emma and David would have to deal with the trauma of seeing their mother arrested, prosecuted, and potentially imprisoned. They would also face the social stigma and financial hardship that came with having a parent convicted of elder abuse. On the other hand, if I didn't report the crimes, Sarah might interpret my silence as permission to continue or escalate her theft. She might also become more sophisticated about hiding her activities, making it harder for me to protect myself in the future. More fundamentally, Emma had risked her relationship with her mother to bring me this information. She had trusted me to handle it responsibly, and she deserved to see that her courage in exposing wrongdoing had led to meaningful consequences. I called the social worker who had conducted my assessment the previous week and asked for her advice about how to proceed. Mrs. Murphy, she said, what you're describing is criminal elder abuse, and you have clear evidence of multiple financial crimes. You have every right to report this to law enforcement, and honestly, that might be the best way to prevent your daughter from stealing from other elderly family members or friends in the future. But what about my grandchildren? They'll be devastated if their mother is arrested. Your grandchildren have already shown remarkable maturity in recognizing that their mother's behavior is wrong. They might be upset in the short term, but in the long term, they'll be better off learning that actions have consequences and that you can't maintain relationships through manipulation and theft. And if I don't report it? Then you're sending the message that family members can steal from elderly relatives without consequences as long as they're clever about it. You're also leaving yourself vulnerable to continued exploitation. The social worker helped me understand that this wasn't really a choice between protecting my grandchildren and protecting myself. It was a choice between teaching Emma and David that moral principles matter even when they're costly, or teaching them that family loyalty means covering up crimes and enabling continued abuse. When I thought about it that way, the decision became clearer. Emma had already demonstrated that she valued honesty and fairness over family convenience. She deserved to see that taking moral stands, even difficult ones, could lead to positive change. The next morning, I called Emma and asked if she could visit me again after school. When she arrived, I showed her the information I had gathered about reporting financial crimes and explained the options available to us. "Emma, if we report this to the police, your mother will probably be arrested. She could go to jail, and your family will have to deal with a lot of difficult consequences. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been thinking about it all night," Emma said. "And I keep coming back to the same question: what if Mom is doing this to other people too? What if she's stealing from other old people who don't have grandchildren to help them figure it out?" Once again, Emma had cut straight to the heart of the moral issue. Sarah's crimes against me were part of a pattern of behavior that could be affecting other victims who were more vulnerable and had fewer resources to protect themselves. "There's something else," Emma continued. "David and I have been talking, and we think Mom might be stealing from our college funds too. The accounts she set up for us always seem to have less money in them than we expect, and she always has explanations about market fluctuations or fee changes, but the numbers never really add up." This possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If Sarah was willing to steal from her elderly mother, she might also be willing to steal from her children's education funds, especially if she thought they wouldn't be sophisticated enough to detect the theft. "If that's true," I said, "then reporting her crimes might actually protect your financial futures as well as mine." "Exactly. And honestly, Grandma, I'd rather take out student loans and work my way through college than go to school on money Mom stole from people." The moral sophistication of this statement took my breath away. Emma was willing to sacrifice her own financial security in order to restore money that had been stolen from me, and she was mature enough to understand that accepting the benefits of theft made her complicit in the crimes. That afternoon, we called the police together. The detective who took our statement was professional, thorough, and unsurprised by what we told him. "We see cases like this more often than you might think," he said. Adult children with access to elderly parents' accounts, gradually increasing the amounts they take, using emotional manipulation to prevent victims from reporting the crimes. He explained the process for pursuing criminal charges and helped us understand what evidence would be most useful for building a strong case. The papers Emma had found would be crucial, but they would also need bank records, documented communications, and testimony from witnesses who could verify the pattern of behavior. "Mrs. Murphy, I want you to understand that this process might take months or even years to resolve completely. Your daughter will probably hire a lawyer, and she might try to negotiate a plea deal that avoids prison time. Are you prepared for a long legal battle?" "I'm 72 years old," I said. "I don't have unlimited time, but I have enough time to see this through. And Miss Emma, you should know that you might be called to testify against your mother in court. That's going to be very difficult for you emotionally." Emma nodded solemnly. "I understand. But I think it's the right thing to do." 2 days later, police officers arrested Sarah at her office, charging her with multiple counts of elder abuse, theft, and financial fraud. The arrest made the local news, and I spent several uncomfortable days dealing with phone calls from reporters and neighbors who had heard about the situation. Emma and David came to stay with me that evening, having decided they didn't want to be home when Sarah was released on bail. We ordered pizza and watched old movies, creating a sense of normalcy in the midst of a crisis that was reshaping all of our lives. "Are you guys okay?" I asked as we were getting ready for bed. "It's weird," David said. "I'm sad that Mom is in trouble, but I'm also kind of relieved that the truth is finally out there. It was starting to feel like our whole family was based on lies." Emma nodded in agreement. "I kept thinking there was something wrong with me for being suspicious about the money stuff. Now I realize I was right to be suspicious, and I wish I had figured it out sooner." "You figured it out at exactly the right time," I said. "If you hadn't found those papers, I might never have known how much your mother was actually taking." That night, as I listened to Emma and David sleeping in my small guest room, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. I had gone from being an isolated, exploited elderly woman to someone surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my welfare. My grandchildren had revealed themselves to be young people of remarkable character and integrity. And I had discovered that I was capable of standing up for myself even when doing so was difficult and costly. But I had also lost my relationship with my daughter, probably permanently. Sarah would never forgive me for having her arrested, and I would never be able to trust her again. The family structure I had spent decades trying to preserve was gone, but what was emerging in its place felt more honest and sustainable. 3 weeks later, Sarah called me from her lawyer's office. "Mom, we need to talk about resolving this situation. My attorney says that if you're willing to drop the criminal charges, we can work out a restitution agreement that gets you your money back without me having to go to prison." Her voice was different, less manipulative, more businesslike. She was finally speaking to me as an adult dealing with another adult, rather than as someone managing a difficult elderly relative. "What kind of restitution agreement?" I asked. "I would pay back everything I took, plus interest and penalties. I would also agree to have no access to any of your financial accounts going forward, and I would submit to regular financial monitoring to make sure I'm not stealing from anyone else." The offer was tempting, especially because it would spare Emma and David the trauma of seeing their mother go to prison. But I had learned not to make important decisions based solely on my desire to avoid conflict or protect other people from consequences they had earned. "I need to discuss this with Emma and David before I make any decisions," I said. "They're children, Mom. This should be between you and me. They're the ones who exposed your crimes, Sarah. They deserve to have input on how those crimes are resolved." When I explained Sarah's offer to Emma and David, their responses were swift and unanimous. "Don't do it," Emma said immediately. "Mom needs to face real consequences, or she'll just figure out better ways to steal money in the future." Plus, David added, "If you let her pay the money back instead of going to jail, it's like saying that rich people can buy their way out of trouble but poor people have to go to prison. That's not fair." Once again, my grandchildren had demonstrated moral reasoning that was clearer and more principled than that of the adults around them. They understood that justice required proportional consequences for wrongdoing, and they weren't willing to compromise that principle even to protect their mother from punishment. "Are you sure?" I asked. "If your mother goes to prison, it will affect your entire family for years." "If she doesn't go to prison," Emma said, "she'll keep stealing from people, and that will affect lots of families for years." I called Sarah's lawyer the next day and declined the plea offer. "My family and I appreciate the offer to make restitution, but we don't think financial compensation addresses the full scope of the crimes that were committed." 6 months later, Sarah pled guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The judge ordered her to pay full restitution and prohibited her from having access to any elderly person's financial accounts without court supervision. During the sentencing hearing, I was given an opportunity to address the court about the impact of Sarah's crimes. I had written a statement, but when the time came to read it, I found myself speaking from the heart instead. "Your Honor, the defendant is my daughter, and I love her. But love doesn't excuse theft, and family relationships don't justify elder abuse. What my daughter did to me wasn't just about money, it was about respect, dignity, and trust. She taught me that I had no value beyond my willingness to provide financial support, and she used my fear of loneliness to manipulate me into accepting treatment that no human being should have to accept." I looked at Sarah, sitting at the defendant's table with her head bowed, and felt a complex mixture of sadness, anger, and hope. I hope that prison gives my daughter time to think about the person she wants to be and the relationships she wants to have. I hope she learns that love is not something you can buy or sell, and families are not businesses where emotional connection is optional. But most importantly, I hope that her punishment sends a message to other people who might be tempted to exploit elderly family members. We are not banks that exist for your convenience. We are not resources to be managed and discarded. We are human beings who deserve respect, honesty, and genuine affection. When I finished speaking, the courtroom was completely silent. Emma and David, sitting behind me, were both crying quietly. Even Sarah's lawyer looked moved by what I had said. After the hearing, reporters asked me questions about elderly abuse and how other families could avoid similar problems. I found myself speaking publicly about issues I had never discussed before: the isolation many elderly people experience, the way financial desperation can corrupt family relationships, and the importance of maintaining dignity and self-respect even when doing so is costly. "The hardest thing," I told one reporter, "is learning to distinguish between people who need your help and people who are using your help. Both might claim to love you, but only one actually will." In the months that followed Sarah's sentencing, my life changed in ways I had never anticipated. Emma and David moved in with me temporarily while their father established a new living situation for the family. Having young people in my apartment again brought energy and purpose to my daily routine in ways I had forgotten were possible. Emma helped me set up a computer and taught me to use video calling to stay in touch with distant relatives I had lost contact with over the years. David worked with me in my small balcony garden, transforming it from 6 pots of geraniums into a thriving collection of herbs and vegetables that supplied much of our cooking. More importantly, I began to understand what healthy family relationships actually looked like. Emma and David asked for my opinions on important decisions, shared their daily experiences without being prompted, and offered help with household tasks and technology challenges without being asked. They treated me as someone whose wisdom and experience were valuable, whose emotional well-being mattered, and whose company was genuinely enjoyable. "Grandma," Emma said one evening as we were preparing dinner together, "I'm glad you had Mom arrested, even though it was hard at the time." "Why?" I asked. "Because now I understand the difference between loving someone and letting them hurt people. I used to think family loyalty meant you had to support family members no matter what they did, but you taught me that real love sometimes requires setting boundaries and holding people accountable for their behavior. That's a hard lesson to learn at your age. It's a harder lesson to learn when you're older and you've spent years accepting treatment you shouldn't have accepted," she replied, with the kind of insight that continued to amaze me. Meanwhile, my relationship with my son Michael had also evolved in unexpected ways. When he learned about Sarah's crimes and his children's role in exposing them, he flew out from California to spend a week with us and assess the situation for himself. "Mom," he said after seeing how Emma and David interacted with me, "I owe you an apology. When Sarah called me saying you were acting paranoid and making financial decisions that didn't make sense, I should have talked to you directly instead of just believing her version of events. You were trying to be a good brother," I said. "You couldn't have known she was lying. But I could have known you better. I realized this week that I don't actually know much about your daily life or what's important to you or how you spend your time. I've been treating you like a distant relative instead of like my mother." Michael began calling me weekly instead of monthly, sharing details about his work, his children's activities, and his own thoughts and concerns rather than just checking in about my health and safety. He also started planning annual visits to New York instead of expecting me to always travel to California when we wanted to spend time together. "I want Emma and David to see that it's possible to maintain close relationships with elderly family members based on mutual respect and genuine affection," he explained. "They shouldn't think that Sarah's behavior was normal just because it was what they grew up with." But perhaps the most unexpected development was my relationship with Marisol Martinez, my neighbor who had been such an important source of support during the worst period of my conflict with Sarah. What had started as casual conversations over tea evolved into a deep friendship that enriched both of our lives immeasurably. Marisol and I began taking weekly trips to museums, attending community events, and exploring neighborhoods of New York that neither of us had visited before. We joined a senior center book club, volunteered together at a local food bank, and supported each other through the various health challenges and bureaucratic frustrations that come with aging. "You know what I realized?" Marisol said one afternoon as we sat watching Emma and David play basketball in a nearby park. "I spent so many years after my husband died focusing on what I had lost that I forgot to pay attention to what I might still gain. This friendship with you, watching these beautiful young people grow up, having adventures in the city, none of this would have happened if I had stayed locked in my apartment feeling sorry for myself." "I know exactly what you mean," I said. "I spent years thinking that my job was to make myself useful to other people, and I forgot that my job was to make myself happy." 6 months after Sarah was released from prison, she called me. I was surprised to hear from her, since we had had no contact during her incarceration and I had assumed she would blame me permanently for her legal troubles. "Mom," she said, her voice sounding different in ways I couldn't immediately identify, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to call and apologize. Not because my lawyer told me to, or because I want something from you, but because I've spent the past year and a half thinking about what I did and why I did it, and I finally understand how wrong I was." I listened cautiously, unsure whether this was genuine remorse or another form of manipulation. I told myself that I was just borrowing money to help my family through a difficult time, and that you wouldn't miss it because you had more than you needed. But the truth is, I was stealing from you because I was too proud to ask for help and too selfish to consider how my actions were affecting you emotionally. She paused, and I could hear her crying softly. "The worst part is that I convinced myself you were becoming a burden, and I used that as an excuse to treat you terribly. I was so focused on what I thought you should be doing for me that I never thought about what I should be doing for you." "What made you realize this?" I asked. Partly it was being in prison with other women who had committed similar crimes against their families. Hearing them tell their stories made me realize how many excuses I was making for my behavior, and how much damage I was doing to people who loved me. But mostly it was the letters Emma and David sent me. They never accused me or criticized me directly, but they would write about things they were doing with you, and it was clear that they were getting something from your relationship that they had never gotten when I was controlling their access to you. What do you mean? They wrote about conversations with you about books and ideas and memories, about projects you were working on together, about advice you gave them about problems at school. They were relating to you as a person with wisdom and experience and interesting perspectives, not just as a grandmother who existed to give them money and gifts. I realized that I had been preventing them from having a real relationship with you because I was threatened by the possibility that they might value your opinions more than mine, or that they might compare how you treated people with how I treated people and find me lacking. This insight was more perceptive than anything Sarah had ever said to me before her arrest. She was finally beginning to understand that her control over my access to Emma and David had been motivated by insecurity rather than legitimate parental concern. Sarah, I said carefully, I appreciate you calling to apologize. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge what actually happened and take responsibility for your choices. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect us to go back to having any kind of normal relationship. I just wanted you to know that I understand now that what I did was criminal and unforgivable, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. I do forgive you, I said, surprising myself with the words. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to pretend that nothing happened or go back to the way things were. Too much trust was broken, and too much damage was done. I understand. I just hope that maybe someday, if I can prove that I've really changed, we might be able to build some kind of new relationship based on honesty and respect instead of need and manipulation. We talked for another 30 minutes, and I was struck by how different Sarah sounded. Gone was the defensive, manipulative edge that had characterized our interactions for years. She spoke directly, took responsibility for her actions, and made no requests for money, forgiveness, or special treatment. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in relation to Sarah for years: hope. Not hope that we would return to our old relationship, but hope that she might be capable of genuine change and that Emma and David might someday be able to have a healthy relationship with their mother. But I also felt clear about my own boundaries. Forgiveness didn't require me to trust Sarah with access to my money or my emotional well-being. It simply meant that I was no longer interested in punishing her or protecting myself from her continued presence in the world. A year later, Emma graduated from high school as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Columbia University. David was accepted to a prestigious arts high school where he would study photography and digital media. Both of them had thrived during the time they lived with me, and both had developed into young people of remarkable character and integrity. At Emma's graduation party, which we held in my small apartment with help from several neighbors including Marisol, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that night when I overheard Sarah's conversation about illegal immigrants and stolen money. The elderly woman who had been too afraid to question her daughter's financial requests was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and insisted on being treated with respect. The isolated apartment dweller who had no social connections beyond manipulative family relationships was gone, replaced by someone with rich friendships and meaningful community involvement. Most importantly, the desperate grandmother who had tried to buy love through financial generosity was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that genuine relationship was based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and emotional intimacy rather than financial dependency. Grandma, Emma said as we were cleaning up after the party, I want to thank you for teaching me about courage. What do you mean? You showed me that it's possible to stand up for yourself even when doing so is scary and costly. When you had Mom arrested, you knew it might mean losing your whole family, but you did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, I admitted. But it was also the thing that saved our family. If you hadn't been brave enough to expose what was happening, David and I would have grown up thinking that exploiting people who love you is normal. We might have become people who used other people instead of people who care about other people. As I watched Emma and David preparing for their adult lives, I realized that my decision to prosecute Sarah had given me something far more valuable than financial restitution. It had given me the satisfaction of knowing that I had helped shape two young people who would treat their elderly relatives with dignity and respect, who would value honesty over convenience, and who would understand that family love should be unconditional but family access should be earned. On a warm evening in September, as I sat on my balcony watching the lights of Queens come alive around me, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The geraniums that had once been my only source of beauty had been joined by tomatoes, herbs, and flowering vines that David and I had started from seeds. The tiny space had become a garden that supplied food for our meals and beauty for our daily lives. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emma, now settled into her dorm room at Columbia. Just wanted to say goodnight and tell you I love you. Not because I need anything, just because I do. David, who was staying with his father during the school week but spent weekends with me, was practicing guitar in the living room, filling the apartment with music that would have been impossible during the years when I was too depressed to enjoy anything. Marisol knocked on the door, carrying 2 cups of the café con leche she made better than anyone else in Queens, ready for our evening conversation about books, politics, neighborhood gossip, and the 1,000 small observations that make up a life shared with someone who genuinely enjoys your company. This life, full of real relationships, honest conversations, and meaningful activities, was the life I had inadvertently traded away during years of trying to buy love and avoid abandonment. It was the life I had reclaimed by learning that respect was more important than approval, that boundaries were more important than peace, and that truth was more important than family harmony. As I sipped Marisol's too strong coffee and listened to David's improving guitar skills, I thought about the woman I had been 2 years ago, exhausted, exploited, and convinced that her value to her family was entirely financial. That woman had been afraid of almost everything, afraid of being alone, afraid of being seen as selfish, afraid of demanding too much, afraid of not giving enough. But that woman had also been brave in ways she didn't recognize at the time. She had found the courage to eavesdrop on a conversation that shattered her illusions. She had found the strength to ask difficult questions even when the answers were painful. She had found the wisdom to seek help from professionals who could validate her perceptions and guide her toward resources she needed. Most importantly, that woman had found the love for her grandchildren to expose crimes that were being committed in their names, even though doing so meant shattering the family structure she had spent decades trying to preserve. Looking back, I could see that every difficult decision had led to unexpected growth and previously unimaginable possibilities. Every moment of standing up for myself had revealed strength I didn't know I possessed. Every boundary I had set had created space for healthier relationships to flourish. The trust fund that Sarah had stolen from was now restored and carefully protected, managed by professionals who had no personal interest in my decisions and no access to my accounts beyond what was necessary for official transactions. But more importantly, I had learned that my real wealth was not financial. It was the wisdom I had acquired through 7 decades of living, the humor I had developed through surviving various challenges, and the capacity for love I had maintained despite being hurt by people I had trusted. Emma and David would graduate from college without debt because I could now afford to support their education directly, through legitimate channels that didn't require anyone to lie or steal. But even more important than the money I could provide was the example I had set for them of how to navigate relationships with integrity, how to recognize exploitation disguised as love, and how to choose difficult truths over comfortable lies. As the evening grew darker and the sounds of the city settled into their nighttime rhythm, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with the life I had rebuilt from the rubble of broken trust and shattered illusions. This apartment, these relationships, these daily routines, they represented a kind of wealth that no one could steal from me because they were based on genuine mutual respect and affection rather than financial dependency or emotional manipulation. When people asked me for advice about dealing with difficult family relationships, I always told them the same thing: love is not something you can buy with money, time, or sacrifice. Love is something that exists or doesn't exist based on how people treat each other when there's nothing to be gained from the relationship. If someone only contacts you when they need something, that's not love, that's business. If someone speaks to you differently when they want money than when they don't need anything, that's not love, that's manipulation. If someone threatens to withdraw affection when you set boundaries or ask questions, that's not love, that's control. Real love, I learned, looks like Emma calling to say goodnight not because she needed anything but because she enjoyed connecting with me. Real love looks like David spending his weekend time teaching me guitar chords because he wanted to share something he enjoyed. Real love looks like Marisol bringing coffee not because she owed me anything but because she valued my company. Real love, most surprisingly, looks like having the courage to prosecute someone who has betrayed your trust, not because you want to punish them but because you want to prevent them from continuing to hurt people and because you want to demonstrate that some behaviors are unacceptable regardless of family relationships. The years I had spent accepting inadequate treatment in order to maintain family peace had been wasted years, but they hadn't been meaningless years. They had taught me to recognize the difference between genuine care and performance, between healthy relationships and exploitative arrangements, between family members who loved me and family members who used me. Those hard-earned insights were now part of who I was, and they informed every relationship I formed and every decision I made. I would never again mistake being needed for being loved, being convenient for being valued, or being afraid of loneliness for being willing to accept disrespect. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I liked and respected, someone who had found the strength to defend herself, the wisdom to distinguish between real friends and convenient relationships, and the courage to choose truth over comfort even when doing so was costly. This woman in the mirror was 74 years old, living on a modest income in a small apartment in Queens, with a daughter in prison and a family structure that bore no resemblance to what she had originally planned. But she was also someone who was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her welfare, who had meaningful ways to contribute to other people's lives, and who went to sleep each night knowing she had spent the day being true to her values and honest about her experiences. That woman was worth fighting for, worth protecting, and worth celebrating. It had taken me 7 decades to fully understand that truth, but understanding it had made all the difference in the world. Every morning now, when I wake to the sounds of the city and the scent of the herbs growing on my balcony, I remember that I am living the life I chose rather than the life that was imposed on me by other people's needs and expectations. That knowledge fills me with a kind of peace and satisfaction that no amount of money could purchase and no family obligation could provide. I earned this peace through making difficult decisions and accepting difficult consequences. I earned this satisfaction through learning to value my own dignity more than other people's approval. I earned this life through having the courage to tell the truth about my experiences even when doing so hurt people I loved. And every day, I wake up grateful that I was brave enough to overhear that conversation about illegals and stolen money, because that conversation was the beginning of my journey from exploitation to liberation, from fear to courage, from being a victim to being someone who could protect herself and others from similar abuse. The woman who trembled at the thought of confronting her daughter is still part of me, but she no longer controls my decisions. She reminds me of how far I've traveled and how much strength I've discovered, but she doesn't limit what I'm willing to do to protect myself and the people I care about. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I made a mental note to call Emma and David tomorrow, not because I needed anything from them but simply because I enjoyed them and wanted to hear about their day. I made another mental note to ask Marisol if she wanted to visit the botanical garden this weekend, not because I was afraid of being alone but because I genuinely valued her company and thought she would enjoy the orchid exhibit. These plans for tomorrow represented the kind of life I was now living, full of choices made from strength rather than fear, connections based on mutual enjoyment rather than mutual need, and activities driven by curiosity and interest rather than obligation and manipulation. This life hadn't been given to me as a gift or discovered by accident. I had created it through a series of small, brave decisions that ultimately transformed everything about how I saw myself and how I allowed other people to treat me. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you were valued only for what you could provide rather than who you actually were? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was taking advantage of your generosity or using your fear of abandonment to manipulate your decisions? Share your story in the comments below. Let others know that they're not alone in facing these challenges, and that it's possible to rebuild your life based on dignity and genuine respect even when doing so seems impossible. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing stories that matter, stories that might help someone else find the courage to stand up for themselves and demand the treatment they deserve. Remember, you are worth fighting for, no matter how old you are, how much you need your family, or how afraid you are of being alone. Real love doesn't require you to accept disrespect, and real family doesn't require you to sacrifice your dignity in order to maintain connections. You deserve better than being valued only for your usefulness, and it's never too late to start demanding that better treatment